Okay, so tell me a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in the disability community.
Um, well, first of all, thank you for having me, Laszlo. I appreciate it. I sort of inadvertently got involved in the disability world way back in 2002. I was a very young person and was just not very long out of college. I actually got recruited off of Monster by a headhunter to go and work for a company in Colorado Springs that ran the Regional Information Center on the Americans with Disabilities Act. And they were looking for somebody who had writing experience. And my undergrad is actually in English. So my interview process with the organization involved a lot of writing samples, and they actually threw me in on a computer and said, go write something, here's the prompt. And I, had to generate that. So when I originally started in the ADA world in particular, I knew there was a law called the Americans with Disabilities Act. I knew a little bit about disabilities, but I didn't really have any experience. And so I definitely started on the ground level. And that was almost 23 years ago now. So something that was just a fluke job offer has turned into a career for me. But more importantly, it's turned into a passion for me because as I've worked my way through and I've become a subject matter expert, I've been able to also recognize the impact that disability laws and diversity and equity and inclusion have on people in my own life, including myself. And it's only been in the last few years of my career that I've really embraced the role of self-advocate in my professional activities. So it's been kind of an interesting journey for me over the last 20 years that I've evolved and grown as a person and as an individual with a disability, as well as helping others learn about the laws and what it means and how to do things to comply with those laws.
Hmm. Yeah. So tell me a little bit about your work as a disability inclusion professional and self-advocate.
Sure. So, like I said, I started this journey as an information specialist on the Americans with Disabilities Act. I was designated as the person that was going to become an expert in the employment provisions of the ADA or Title I. So for 11 years, I spent my career learning, growing, and developing with the Rocky Mountain ADA Center, which is headquartered in Colorado Springs. And it's one of 10 regional centers that is funded by the Administration on Community Living through the National Institute on Disability and Independent Living Research, or NIDLR. I eventually became project director and actually ran the project and its staff and programs for 6 years. And then in 2013, I went out as a freelance consultant, and that's what I've been doing the last almost 10 years, is working rather than just doing education. I've actually been working with organizations, primarily employers, both private and local and state governments, to understand what their responsibilities are under the ADA and other federal laws, but also strategies and strategic planning, visioning, to make sure that they truly are creating an environment that is welcoming and inclusive of employees and applicants with disabilities. I still am very active in the ADA national network. I am actually a consultant for a couple of the regions. I am a regular presenter at the National ADA Symposium, which is our national conference that we have every year. All you can eat, drink, and think about the ADA. I'm also involved in the ADA Coordinator Certification Training Program. And that's a program that was designed to allow people who are working in the field to gain some accreditation and some credibility in the work that they do through a certification program that's handled through the Great Plains ADA Center. But I've had the pleasure to work with Fortune 50 companies, state and local governments across the country. I've had the opportunity to travel internationally to talk about disability inclusion in the workplace. And it really is a passion of mine. And through the work that I've done, primarily through training, I do a lot of writing. So I develop a lot of materials for organizations, toolkits, fact sheets. Basically, I take really complicated ADA information and try to distill it into something that people not only can understand, but they don't avoid it. They actually, enjoy reading it, enjoy participating. I develop curriculum, web courses, those kinds of things. So I've really had the opportunity to help people understand not only what the laws say, but also what the business benefits of complying with those laws are. And that's been a great thing for me. And then, as I said, in the last few years, I've also really expanded the role that my self-advocacy plays in my professional life, in terms of presentation topics that I do, articles that I write for people, for their newsletters and their blogs and those kinds of things. But I have a lot more conversations with clients and audiences about my experience as somebody who lives with a major psychiatric disability, and have since I was a young adolescent. So that's been a key part of my growth as a professional in the last few years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So my next question here is, how do you make sure that like people with disabilities have the resources they need to be independent and self-sufficient? Like, what are some of the ways that you can do that?
Sure. So I've had the benefit over the last 2 decades to work with a lot of service providers in the disability world. And one of the things I really work with individuals with are self-advocacy strategies for the workplace. So we talk about, either one-on-one or in like a workshop group setting where we talk, and when I use the term workshop, I mean, a training opportunity where we can role play and things. But we walk through decisions about disclosing a disability, because for some of us, we have invisible, non-obvious disabilities, and it's very much a conscious decision whether we tell an employer or a potential employer that we have any kind of limitations in the workplace because of an underlying disability. So we talk about strategies for disclosure, how to ask for accommodations, how to even figure out if you need a workplace support to do your job, if that's really kind of the avenue that you need to take to be successful in the workplace. And then, conversations about, addressing if like an employer or a manager asks you questions that you're really not sure that they can ask about your disability, those kinds of things, how to field those very practical, real world, in things that happen all the time, how to deal with those realistically. So I've had an opportunity, and I still continue to field questions from individuals, who are dealing with very specific situations in their workplace. And we talk about, what the law says, what their rights and responsibilities are, and then we brainstorm and come up with very practical strategies they can use to address those problems and try to find a resolution with their employer. And that's, a hugely helpful thing for a lot of people with disabilities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. My next question here is like, I know we've already talked about that, but what kinds of stakeholders do you partner with in your efforts to like disability inclusion and self-advocacy? And just like what impact does, those partnerships have on like the greater community and people with disabilities themselves?
So I'm a huge proponent of collaboration, and I think that's because I came up through a regional ADA center, and the fact that that is one of our the charges of the regional centers is to build partnerships within the regions at the local, state, and regional levels, to be successful, to understand and implement, in particular, the Americans with Disabilities Act, but also, things like FMLA, the impact of disability on like workers' compensation. There's a lot of different laws that can, kind of crisscross and come into play. So I've been it's been a huge part of my career that I've been able to really touch a very broad range of stakeholders, because it's anyone that has rights or responsibilities under U.S. federal disability laws. So that's everybody from individuals with disabilities, their families, their, whether that's spouse, parent, sibling, grandparent, obviously service providers like disability service providers, and other nonprofit organizations, educational facilities, whether that's public schools, colleges and universities. I've also been able to work quite a bit over the years with state and local governments, whether that's their ADA coordinator, their parks and recreation departments, city planning, lots of different groups where disability touches what they do. I've been able to collaborate with them. Architects and designers, individuals that are building or remodeling things where accessibility might become an issue. It just so happens that I'm sort of an interesting, because of the way my mind works, I do lots of different things. And I grew up in the construction business. My father's been in it since the late 60s.
Mm.
And I actually help support the family business, which is a commercial construction company. And I do some work for, support that effort as well. So I kind of cross lots of different industries and things. But I've also partnered and collaborated with attorneys, protection and advocacy group organizations in each state. And then of course, organizations, employers, people that employ people with disabilities. So I really do run the gamut in terms of organizations that I've been able to partner with over the years. And I think that in order for there to be really significant impact in the work that we're doing in disability diversity and inclusion, we have to all come to the table and come up with strategies. Because all you have to do is look at the employment rates of people with disabilities over the last 40 years and see that they've maintained kind of a very plateaued level of workforce engagement. And you can see that in order for us to find a solution where people with disabilities are truly integrated and included in the workplace, we all have to come together to make that happen. Because there isn't just one of us or another of us that's going to make it work. We have to all work together to really see impact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because that's what my next question was, like, how do you create an inclusive and welcoming environment for people with disabilities, for employment and other things? Because I know there's like a stigma around people with disabilities in terms of like employment and stuff, where they're not getting as hired as much. I've been a product of those. I've been applying to numerous jobs as well. And so like, how can like companies and other entities really sort of work to include people with disabilities? And
Sure.
yeah.
I think there's a couple. I mean, that's a big question, Laszlo, to be honest. And I think there's a lot of different strategies, but I guess there's a couple of things that probably are worth a specific mention in our conversation today. I think the first one is that organizations employ people with disabilities, whether they realize it or not. Even if they have not made a commitment to actively recruit people with disabilities, they have employees in their current ranks that have some form of disability. Just if you look at the statistics, 1 in 5 of us, or 20% of the population, has a disability as defined under the Americans with Disabilities Act and other statutes. There are just a lot of people that have chosen not to disclose that disability because it's not obvious in the workplace. So I think there's a lot of work that can be done on a cultural level within organizations to help raise awareness of disability issues, but also show that the environment is welcoming to people with disabilities. Whether that is, scheduling regular periodic training to, build awareness of different disability issues, just doing basic disability awareness training, recognizing things like Mental Health Awareness Month in May, or National Disability Employment Awareness Month in October. Any of these national kinds of events, the International Day of People with Disabilities in December, any of those kind of events, if organizations can schedule something, whether it's a brown bag lunch and learn, or a webinar, or some kind of activity that's around those sorts of things, that helps just raise the awareness of disability. And that can make a huge part, because what I found over the last 2 decades is that it's very rare that you find an organization that blatantly wants to discriminate against somebody with a disability. It's more that things happen because they don't know. They're not aware, they don't understand, or they're scared to ask questions about someone's disability. And just helping to eliminate some of that fear of the unknown can really help build, at least start to build, a more welcoming, inclusive culture. The other big thing I think that a lot of companies have made in the past and are getting better about is the concept of nothing about us without us. And so I think what happened in the early days of disability inclusion and diversity was we had non-disabled people in organizations trying to have these conversations and make plans without actually talking to people with disabilities, either in the community or in their own organization. And so it really felt like it was more of a checking a box on a list, or just paying lip service to inclusion, but not actually including people with disabilities. And so I think that's probably a huge component, is that it's very important for organizations, whether it's community groups, your state, your city, your city government, if they're making plans to increase or improve access in your community, involve people with disabilities in that. And it's not just people in wheelchairs. It's people who are dealing with learning disabilities, people who have mental health, people who have chronic health issues like diabetes or multiple sclerosis, those sorts of things, so that you get a sense of the cross disability interests, not just one group of individuals with disabilities. And so I think that's really important, is that inclusion. And one thing in particular that employers are starting to do is use something called employee resource groups, or business resource groups, depends on what they call it. But basically these are very much a grassroots organization within a company that is made up of individuals, either individuals who have the same characteristic or are allies to that. So a lot of groups have ERGs that focus on like veterans, or Latino, Latinx interests, or women leaders in the organization, those kinds of things. And we're starting to see more ERGs that are focused around disability as a topic. And it's not necessarily people that have disabilities. Some of them are parents of children with disabilities, or they have other family members that are just, they consider themselves allies. And that group, that employee resource group, there are huge business benefits to those organizations, because businesses can tap into that group of individuals who are experts in the topic, and can start to go to them for business advice. Like, what's the best way to market our product to parents of kids with disabilities? And they can have that conversation and come up with those strategies. So having that, not only building on your culture, including people with disabilities in your diversity efforts, but then going that extra step of involving them in just the business operation of the organization, and getting input from this hugely beneficial little group, or a big group that you could have that deals with this every day in their personal lives. So that's a big one.
Mhm.
And then I know I'm kind of going on, but I think, and this kind of gets back to my personal story, is I think that it's also important to identify within your organization, whether at the community level, the corporate level, whatever the setting is, identify some key individuals who are willing to say, I have a disability, and then talk about it. in the organization, because that's going to help build that visibility. So where we see these companies, you and I both know that there's all these organizations that do like the top companies for people with disabilities and the most disability diverse companies. And one characteristic that's really common of all of those groups, and I can name, I don't want to name some of them because I don't want to seem like I'm endorsing, but is a lot of times there's a very high level, usually like corporate C-suite executive who either has a disability or has like a really personal connection to disability, a spouse or a child or a sibling or a parent. And so they bring that personal history to it. And it's when those people are able to talk about it and drive disability inclusion, that's when we see the most success in organizations, is to have those key leaders. And that's what I've tried to do over the last few years, is really start talking a lot more about my experience as a professional with a disability, because I've had some very real instances where, diversity executives have come to me and said, like that totally changed my outlook on what we're doing. Or one situation that really kind of kicked off this initiative for me, I was at a conference, and it was the first time I had been asked by someone to moderate a panel about mental health in the workplace, with the intention that I would talk a little bit about my own experiences, not just be the professional expert, with the business card and the briefcase, but to make it a little bit more of a personal conversation. And it was scary. It was a national conference, and I'm in this group of like, I'm in front of, I'm on this raised stage. There's 3 of us on the panel, and it's a ballroom filled with 500 people, many of which I don't know, and they're all very senior level executives in large companies that we see commercials for every day on, and so it was a little intimidating, and I'd been doing this a while, but it was still really intimidating. And so I shared some of my story, as a younger person, as a person going through my education, as a person starting out in my career, those kinds of things. And it went well, and it was very well received, and we had a lot of interaction. But it wasn't until later, the conference was hosting a gala and a dinner and an awards show and a cocktail hour. I had a gentleman come up to me who was from one of the big telecommunication firms. And it was one of the companies, like I said, you and I see at least 5 of their commercials every night if we're watching TV. And he was very high up in the executive organizational chart. And he pulled me aside and asked if he could talk to me. And I'm like, oh God, what did I just do? What did I do wrong?
Mm-hmm.
So we stepped aside, and he proceeded to tell me, and he actually started the conversation off by saying, Jana, I want to tell you, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. And I was kind of a little taken aback. I'm like, thank you for what I do? And he goes, you have given me hope for the first time in 2 years. And then he proceeds to tell me about his daughter, who is 13, 14 at the time, diagnosed with a very severe mental health condition. He and her mom, his wife, had been struggling for 2 years, with all kinds of things related to her going to school, self-esteem, self-harm, all of these things that were very, heartbreaking, and they were absolutely supportive and doing everything they could for her. But he said, but hearing your story and hearing that you went through a lot of that same thing at her age, and there's something on the other side of it, like that gave me more hope than I've had in 2 years. And, it's hard, I'm married, wearing makeup at the time, and I'm all dressed up for this gala, and I'm trying not to cry, but it was really hard not to, because that story was, it hit me right, right in the feels, as they say. And that was really the first time I realized that there is benefit to storytelling as a self-advocate. And there are other people that you have the opportunity to talk to, whether it's through a podcast, or whether it's through a training that you're doing in person, or an article that you're writing for a newsletter or something, that there's someone out there in the audience who is going to be helped by the story that you can tell of your own experience. And so I think that's kind of why I've really latched on to the value of us as a self-advocate of storytelling and standing up and being that person to talk about some of these things, particularly with something like mental health, because there's so much stigma attached to it, that it really help kind of spur the conversation, or at least offer people some sort of feeling that there's a way to get through this and be successful somewhere down the line. It might not be tomorrow, but what I'm dealing with today is not hopeless, and I can get through that. And that's a really powerful thing, I think, to do as a person with a disability.
I just feel like talking about that openly amongst the public could really get people to understand like your lived experience,
Mhm.
and it can get people to sort of say, this person went through a lot. I can empathize with that. I can connect with that.
Absolutely. And not that I'm saying that what I've dealt with is the exact same as everybody else, because that's not, you and I both know that's not the case, but at least I can offer my perspective, but also acknowledge that I can understand where you're coming from. You and I may not have the same experience, but I understand that you may have had a history of substance abuse that I've never dealt with personally, but we can at least have a conversation and talk about what that means in the workplace and how we can work through some of those issues so that you're successful in your job. Yeah, so I think, just standing up and being willing to have that conversation really does help eliminate, or at least, bring some awareness to some issues that people don't realize. You and I both know, Laszlo, that the media does not do a great job portraying, in particular, mental health. We have movies and comedies where, people with mental health conditions are the way that they portray them is just, it's not realistic. They're either super violent and they're the bad guy all the time in crime shows, or they're the goofy, silly sibling that makes jokes and is just there for the laugh track or whatever. But it's really rare that you get like a good entertainment avenue, whether it's theater or books or movies or TV shows that handle mental health really well. So having those real life people standing out here going, don't trust what you're seeing on the camera. Like, real life is different. I think that helps kind of to build the conversation into something that's a little bit more useful.
Yeah, I completely agree.